Today in the EU, the most memorable moments of 2024.
According to these results, the candidate for President of the European Commission proposed by the European Council is therefore elected by the European Parliament. I would like to congratulate Ursula von der Leyen on her re-election, and I wish her the very best for the exercise of her mandate.
Thank you very much for being here today to present your much expected report. The report on the competitiveness of the European Union, and I think no one was better placed than you, dear Mario, to carry out a thorough analysis of Europe's competitiveness.
Je dissous donc ce soir l'Assemblée nationale.
I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
This year brought seismic changes across Europe. Political crisis, shifting environmental priorities, and debates about the continent's industrial strategy. From the Green Deal's transformation to the US election, we will explore how decisions made this year will shape the continent for decades. What does a more competitiveness-focused agenda mean for climate policy? And what's next for Europe in a world dominated by tensions between the US and China? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. For this special episode, I'm joined in the studio by three of our tireless editors at Euractiv, starting with publisher René Moerland, economics editor Anna Brunetti, and energy and environment editor Donagh Cagney. Welcome, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Today, we're looking back at the events that shaped 2024, and the list is quite long. After all, we had European elections, many more political crises, a new competitiveness-heavy agenda, and substantial shifts in environmental policies. So forgive me, I know there's a lot to choose from, but let's start from the most interesting piece of news you followed this year in Brussels. René, you want to take over?
You want me to start from this long list? Okay. As you mentioned elections, let me also mention an election. Many of these elections were expected, the outcome not always, but of course, more or less. Sometimes you had a gamble, like the French snap parliamentary elections just after the European elections, which were kind of classical way of a losing president in this case, try to strengthen and solidify his majority, which didn't work out. But the more surprising elections, they haven't taken place yet, but the fall of a government, I think, was in Germany, because it was just on the same day that we had the results of the American elections. The lack of stability in France was already known. We also knew that in this year of transition, the new commission was not in place yet. And that was the moment that Olaf Scholz started by firing his finance minister.
Ich habe den Bundespräsidenten soeben die Entlassung des Bundesministers der Finanzen gebeten. Ich sehe mich zu diesem Schritt gezwungen, Schaden von unserem Land abzuwenden.
Which provoked a crisis in the German government, which is very rare in Germany, but also creates or symbolizes, it shows actually that there are really big transitions and changes going on in Europe. So that's why I would select that moment. Of course, the relationships within the traffic light government, as it was called, between the Liberals, FDP, and the Social Democrats of Scholz's SPD were already bad. So in that case, it was not a surprise. But it actually shows the way it happened, that Scholz, although he already knew that he would possibly not be the one in the lead to maximize next election results for his own party, he apparently really felt and also said that the current state of play in Germany in the changing world couldn't go on like this. Discussions about Schuldenbremse, about austerity politics, about budgetary discipline, about defense spending, about relationship between Germany and Russia, about how Europe has to handle its own things when it comes to relationship with the United States. All this was symbolized in this surprising move by Scholz that led to the fall of his government, a no-confidence vote that only happened this week because the Germans are very organized, and then elections to come in February.
I have to say, as an Italian for once, it's quite surprising to see your government overcoming in length the French and the German. Anyways, Anna, what's your favorite moment of the year?
Well, for me, it was actually the final stages of the CSDDD. It's not an attractive name for a law, but despite its unattractive title, it's actually a quite significant piece of law for different reasons.
This is more than responsible business. This is hugely important for people. This is hugely important for workers in the EU, outside of the EU. But it's also important for the EU because it says something about how we see globalization, how we see trade, how we see sustainability, and whether or not we are willing to put our money where our mouth is.
It was like 5 years in the making. It had gone through trilogues, and then a lot of last-minute political trade-off happened behind closed door, which kind of signified a significant move away from a paradigm where whatever is established during trilogues is set in stone and it represents the accountability of the legislative process, to then seeing substantial changes and amendments to a law happen at the very last minutes after trilogues. And it has been warned by quite a few stakeholders that what was happening with that law, which saw a 70% reduction in scope after trilogues, was a very significant warning sign. The other reason why that law was particularly significant is that it also represented another turn of tide in the policymaking process, because it started during the Green Deal mandate, like during the 5 years of the first commission, von der Leyen Commission, and it's a sustainability-related piece of law. And now what we're seeing is that already, like a few months after it passed into law, we're seeing different sides of the EU bubbles business, obviously, but also member states and MEPs and political parties looking to, again, obtain significant amendments to a law that is already in force. So it's been identified and targeted at the moment as one of the first pieces of legislation that will be subject to the von der Leyen pledge to reduce bureaucracy by 25%, especially in the reporting requirement area. So the CSDDD, but also the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Green Taxonomy are the three pieces of legislation that could be the first ones seeing significant changes for reducing the burden for businesses, as it's been called by policymakers.
Indeed, something that we witnessed in 2024 is the slashing of the Green Deal. Donagh, what do you make of this new clean industrial take on what used to be the Green Deal?
So the Green Deal, I mean, it's been cut back for sure. Maybe it's been pruned rather than slashed. There's still parts of it that are still around. It's still part of the language of the Commission and of Commission President von der Leyen. But there's definitely been a renewed focus. So nature for nature's sake, biodiversity, that's really been put to the side. And the focus really is on climate. And as you say, industry is a big part of it.
It is the growth strategy, the European Green Deal, because emissions have gone down by 32%, while the industry, the economy has grown by 67%. So it is a growth strategy that we have.
It's kind of like a twin crisis for Europe. On the one hand, we certainly need to decarbonize industry, and by kind of the mid-2030s, according to climate models as well. But we're also undergoing massive decarbonization as well. And the idea is the idea of green growth, which is that we can decarbonize our industries, pump a load of cash into them, give them new, cleaner, more efficient ways of producing steel, cars, cement, whatever. And in doing so, we're going to revitalize industry and get some of those jobs back that we're losing. The political consensus, certainly during the Green Deal, is that we decarbonize and it delivers growth and it delivers jobs and it keeps everybody happy. The reality of the last few years has been a bit more complicated. And while it probably will work in the long term, in the short term, there seems to be a fair amount of pain to go through. And that means that a lot of the lobbying and engagement we're seeing in Brussels at the moment, there's a little bit of shadow boxing, as in, of course, industry wants to decarbonize. Of course, net zero is the way to go. But, you know, maybe we could tweak this rule, or maybe we could put this exception in there. And all of a sudden, it's not quite clear what exactly it is they're really pushing for. And that's probably been encapsulated in the ban on internal combustion engine cars in 2035.
You say that green is still part of the language of the Commission. We also seem to see this year a transition from something called green to something called clean.
True.
What is the difference between the two?
That's a fair point, and it's entirely true. I think green, you can strip out all the nature. So Ursula von der Leyen, she's no longer a green, she's clean. That means she doesn't care about the wolves, for example. So a few years ago, the Commission were defending the protection status of the wolves. Now they're using the same arguments to reduce it as well. There's been cutbacks in terms of protection for deforestation as well. All that is gone. So yeah, it's very much clean, and clean is very much linked to industry and pumping cash into industry if it can be done.
Okay, it's competitiveness combined with something green.
Exactly, yeah.
And how much of that is due to the Letta and Draghi report, Anna? I mean, we have these true Italian politicians who lost their luster domestically, but are highly regarded in Brussels. I remember how many expectations there were in both cases right ahead of publication of their reports.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. Like, there was a huge amount of expectations placed on both, first and foremost on the Draghi report, which was seen as much more high profile in a way. The first report came in April and the Draghi report came in September. They're more of a pretext for me, rather than founding documents. Their value is mostly symbolic in that they convey really the next EU agenda. They basically channels the next Commission's agenda, which is in itself going to be much more devoted to a pro-business strategy, and that is the main shift that we've seen through those reports. And when we hear people referring to those reports, interestingly, they rarely go into the specifics of the report.
Yeah.
They mostly refer to them as a symbol to go back to, as a placeholders for this pro-business agenda. How much consensus there is on those reports, effectively on the pragmatics proposals, I wouldn't be so sure about it, because both diplomats, for example, they support a big role for public money and public funding. But if you go and discuss it with stakeholders, they quickly neglect that side of those reports, which is actually a very significant part of both reports, but then it disappears very, very quickly from conversations that we hear in Brussels.
So there's a bit of cherry picking.
Yes, absolutely. And there will be cherry pickings. It was especially with the Draghi report, it's been said that it was redacted in very close collaboration with the Commission. So for as much as it carries his name, it's probably a Commission effort and a von der Leyen effort.
And Draghi's report mentioned, among several others, challenges to the car sector. Donagh, can you tell us more about Europe's political decision regarding the automotive industry?
So there's two big debates going on at the moment, and they're all about CO2 reduction targets. One next year in 2025, and then the big one, 2035, when cars need to be net zero. So there's no CO2 coming out of the tailpipes. These were agreed at the start of the Green Deal. So negotiations kicked off in 2020. It was agreed late 2022. Everybody agreed. There was clear consensus. This was amazing. We were going to be really aggressive on decarbonizing cars. That would give us an edge in terms of having the best new technology. Europe would stay the number one car maker in the world. Fast forward 2 years and the reality is a bit more complicated. China, it turns out, has been following this strategy for 15 years. Maybe we should have realized that. Sales of EVs are down as well, and car makers are really struggling in Europe. We've seen it with the Audi factory in Brussels, just down the road, for example. So all of a sudden, these targets are up for discussion again. 2025, most car makers want to see the rules changed so they can avoid fines, which could be in the billions of euros. They're arguing that they could use this money to invest into batteries, into new electric vehicles. And on 2035 target, it's a bit more complicated. They're pushing for an exemption for e-fuels, so fuels which are synthetically made, which can be carbon neutral. Von der Leyen has said that she's open to doing that in a targeted amendment to the law. But of course, once you do a targeted amendment, the Parliament and the member states can do whatever they want. And what we've seen in the last week is the centre-right EPP party coming up with a position paper, which all of a sudden has a lot more demands for how they'd like to change these rules, which would potentially put in question the actual climate objectives of the rules.
Well, Giada, you asked us at the start of this conversation about events that actually struck us this year. But if you would have asked about the products of the European economy, that I think what Donagh just mentioned was absolutely the transport vehicle of the year, the car, because it symbolizes so much of what's actually happening in the world. Because this discussion about the combustion engine that specifically developed also in Germany, that was not incidental. Because actually we saw this year how the resilience, the competitiveness of the German economy was very much linked to a declining car industry. And now it's really openly called like this in Germany, that the motor of their economy, the car industry, is actually in decline. So they need to transform. And in hindsight, you could see that the way the green economy and the transition to sustainability was addressed maybe didn't take into account sufficiently the resilience of European economy, because indeed it played in the hands of China with a strong electric vehicle economy. And you see that back in tariff discussions right now. So there's a growing sense of vulnerability that's structuring European politics right now.
Indeed, I think going back to what René is saying about the whole car industry saga that we saw unfold through the last few months with the China tariff story, but also with the secular crisis of the German sector and the wider European sector, it's replicated at a wider EU level.
How so?
It kind of replicates a very deep fracture within Europe and the EU in terms of where different member states and political parties see the EU strategy going forward and what approach should the EU pursue in the next 5 years. In a world where its two main trade counterparties, China and the US, have pursued increasingly aggressive industrial strategies that include tariffs, but include also export controls, include pumping money, huge amounts of money into domestic industries and attracting European companies away from Europe itself, such as the Biden Inflation Reduction Act. And this is only going to continue under the Trump presidency. So now, suddenly, while we were focusing on the EV tariff saga for the past year, and it was indeed very crucial, but in a few months, we've seen it turning into a much broader discourse, a trade war, but also what kind of paradigm is the EU going to pursue? Is it really going to leave behind its traditional rule-based system whereby it really abides by WTO rules and it pursue an open trade system, or is it going to step up its strategic game as well? And at the moment, we're seeing a bit of both, but obviously that would depend a lot on what the US policy will be. But at the moment, what was quite surprising was to see both Christine Lagarde, the ECB president, and von der Leyen herself striking an incredibly friendly note towards the new, the upcoming Trump presidency.
We will be working with the new Trump administration in a good manner and look at what is ahead of us. I have some experience to working with President Trump from his former mandate, so there's something to build on. And I think very important is that we analyze together what our shared interests are.
Basically, Lagarde herself mentioned the word a checkbook strategy. So let's open the checkbook and start throwing money at US products if that can keep the Trump presidency and administration friendly to Europe. So in a way, it's a more realpolitik approach that kind of overcomes a more traditionally based global trade system. But at the same time, are we being too conciliatory ahead of times? Because there will come a time where, again, we're facing a huge domestic industrial crisis. How are we going to protect and safeguard domestic industries? Where can Europe grow its own strength?
That was the point from Draghi's report, which really struck out for me. He said, I don't know if these were his exact words, but he said we've been too naive on green or clean industrial strategy, as in we set ourselves really high targets, but then we didn't give ourselves and our companies the means to deliver on them. Whereas our competitors, the US or China, they're going much, much easier on climate targets, but then they're putting as much behind industry as possible. And that includes subsidies, but also tariffs, lead markets, protected markets, that kind of thing.
There's also maybe something that we've seen this year and that we will see also next year, which is maybe you could call it not the Brussels effect, but the Brussels dilemma, which is many of these big shaping changes that we're now addressing, that we're seeing from China, elsewhere, are long-term discussions. Sustainability is a long-term discussion. The relationship with the United States, building up defense forces, industrial investments, competitiveness, it's all long-term. But European politics by nature, which is a negotiation between many different partners, stakeholders, member states, institutions, is very much directed towards finding a middle ground between, even on the shorter term. And the long-term change management is much more difficult. Maybe we've seen in a relatively quieter climate in that sense, the green agenda of the last commission was more long-term. Now, more pressing questions have come up, of course, and start to dominate the agenda. Ukraine war is the very first thing, of course, that happened. Leave aside the whole COVID crisis of the last term. But then you see that actually that it leads to direct changes in the agenda. But it doesn't actually mean that the short-term discussion, for instance, about relationship with the United States, will actually necessarily lead to a rupture, change in the long term. Take Ukraine, energy relationships, investments in industry. Well, the United States will be very necessary actually for Europe in order to be strong. A long-term relationship with China, they will probably not disappear. So it means that this long-term strategy, how will it end up in the long run and where does Europe want to go, still has much difficulty actually to come forward.
And as we get to the finale of this episode, I want to talk about stories that might define next year. What are some of your guesses?
I guess I would pick what happened really recently with Mercosur as a very interesting instance for what could shape the next von der Leyen Commission's approach to this kind of dilemmas. So a deal that has been 25 years in the making, suddenly, because of political crisis in Europe, in Germany and France, and specifically in France, we saw, I guess, like von der Leyen also saw a window of opportunity opening, France being the main opponent of the law for the past 20 plus years. And they finally struck a deal. We don't know the actual content of the deal itself. Will it be split into more consensus parts and leave aside more political debates? Mm-hmm. But the very core of the deal actually is most likely going forward. And it's these same parts that are seeing Europe being hit by farmers' protests for the past year. And it seemed like farmers' protests were one main political factor playing ahead of the EU elections and national elections. But suddenly von der Leyen then turned to the international trade outlook for Europe and went ahead with the deal. So in a way, it's interesting for me to see that yes, the EU is always at the verge of a mental breakdown and like a crisis of identity that has been there since the onset. It's still looking for its own identity. But then on the short term, we see quite shift decision-making happening when we don't expect it. So I think we could see a lot more surprises coming.
Any surprises coming for environment and energy?
To be honest, I'm super interested in energy prices. Because we've seen quite a few surprises there. And we're not at the energy crisis days of 2022, but there's been kind of jitters or rumblings of problems all through this year. In the summer, there was really high energy prices in the Balkans, all the way up to Hungary, and that caused a lot of political grief domestically, both for households who are feeling it, but also for industry, right, who are already under pressure. The solution there was to call for a European solution. They wrote to von der Leyen, the then energy commissioner. Last week, we had an extended period, a week or so, of low wind. And energy prices shot up in parts of Sweden. And the response of Swedish politicians was to blame Germany because all the power was flowing down as well. And the Swedish energy minister was blaming Germany for phasing out nuclear, a decision that was made over 10 years ago. And that's happening again today in the Energy Council. So we know the energy system is quite fragile. We're going to see more spikes like this probably in the next year ahead. It's going to be really interesting to see how the politics of that play out.
Well, René, how do you think the politics of it will play out?
Immediately connected to this is, we didn't mention it yet, but the relationship to Russia from Europe is, of course, one of the biggest topics also for the year to come. We've heard in recent times not only speculations about the inevitability and need for ceasefire negotiations in Ukraine, while at the same time we see Russia actually winning every day on the battlefield. We also see that although the dependency on Russia when it comes to energy has become much less important, it's still there. There's still relationships that are important. And at the same time, we do see that both here in Brussels on the European Union side and on NATO, and specifically, of course, in the part of Europe led maybe by Poland more and more, we see that the danger of Russia and of actual war danger for the European Union and Europe as a whole is coming more and more center stage. So how will that work out with Putin that's now expected to more or less implicitly to become strong, to remain more strong actually than was expected 1 year ago? That will be one of the very important developments of the coming year. But then again, maybe as a last sentence, remember 2 months ago, here in Brussels, you had the discussions starting about taking up relationship with Assad again.
Thank you, René Moerland, Donagh Cagney, and Anna Brunetti.
Thanks.
Cheers, Giada.
You've listened to the last episode before Christmas. Today in the EU team will be on holiday until January 13th. If you think you'll miss us too much, you can listen to the top 10 of our latest episodes starting next Monday. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.